Good morning, everybody. My name is Max Steyer. I'm the president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, and I'm excited to have all of you here today to have a conversation around a topic near and dear to my heart, which is civil service reform. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to co-host this event with the Volcker Alliance, and you'll hear from Tom Ross in a few minutes here. But truly, if I think about the public servants who are the true giants on the issue of reform of the public service, you start with Paul Volcker. He's a giant not just because he's unbelievably tall. He's a giant because he's cared about this issue for many, many years, has led two important national commissions on public service reform, and he's a true believer about the importance of government, the importance of the government workforce, and the importance of making sure that it is agile and vibrant. And I think that's what this conversation is intended to be about. Yesterday, we had a wonderful event in which we were able to celebrate 27 amazing federal employees and teams for the Service to America Medals finalists. Thank you for Jeff and Margaret for being there as well. But it was a great reminder of what this is about. It's about achieving real results for the American people. And we have an unbelievable workforce that is doing such extraordinary things in order to be able to achieve that. I think there are two big problems, in my view, that the data and more suggest that it's getting in the way of that workforce performing in the way that we want it to for the public and that they want to perform. And that is bluntly, they're being failed ultimately by their leaders and by the system that they're operating in. I'm going to just spend 2 minutes on both those concepts, although the main focus here will obviously be on the system. So one of the great services that Jeff at OPM performs is collecting data from the full workforce, the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And it's an extraordinary, rich data trove of information about what is happening in our government. I would posit today that it is the only real-time performance information we have across all of government. And what it shows, again, is a phenomenally mission-committed workforce that isn't getting the leadership it needs to perform in the way that we want it to. And take a look at some of the numbers, where in overall engagement, you're looking at it being about 15 points below a reasonable private sector average, where you have fewer than half the workforce believing that their good work is recognized, and that number is 2/3 plus in the private sector, where you have only 41% or under 41% that believe that they can get the talent that they need to do the job right through the system that we have right now. And an example of that is we have just 6% of the workforce itself being under the age of 30. Now, if you think about IT, you have 5 times as many people over the age of 60 as under the age of 30 in IT. So these are just facts and numbers that ought to provide context to the conversation we're having right now. In sum, we have a legacy government that isn't keeping up with the world around it. And how could it be otherwise when we have a government that is operating under rules that are at minimum 40 years plus old? You tell me the organization in the private sector or anywhere else that's operating under the same rules as it did 40 years ago, and I'm going to show you an organization that isn't as successful as it could be. That's what we need to talk about today. We need to do more than admire the problem. Maroy, my colleague, loves to use that phrase, and I think that's the right phrase to be used. We need to do something about it. I mentioned that Paul Volcker has done 2 national commissions on these issues. It's high time we actually got action and change. And I think there are some very basic common sense things that need to happen. But you're not here to hear from me about those. You're going to hear from a great group of people who will talk more about the things that we can do. The reason why I started off with talking about leadership and these system changes is I do want to be clear that it's not only the system that we need to change. It's not enough for us to change the rules. We have to change the behaviors of the people who lead government. And this is not a political statement. This is about political career. It doesn't matter. It's the people who are in charge. They need to own this issue. If you force me to tell you what's the one thing that I think needs to change most in government, it's that leaders in government need to own the organizations that they're responsible for. They need to see that their responsibilities include as priorities making sure we have the right talent, that that talent is managed effectively, and that we have a system that is agile and can respond to the crises of the day. So that's my quick, soapbox setup here. I really appreciate all of you being here. We have some 300 plus people that are online, which is why we are using microphones. And if you all want to wave to the cameras in back there, you can wave to your colleagues in the audience. I'm excited about this conversation. I believe we do have leaders, including Margaret and Jeff, that are committed to making sure that the workforce is able to have the system, the resources, and the leaders that they need to be able to succeed. And I think this is a moment of real opportunity for everybody who cares about our government and ultimately about our country. I think this is a moment of opportunity and a moment for potential change. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce someone who I have enormous confidence in and has been a terrific colleague and partner, Tom Ross from the Volcker Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, and good morning. And good morning to everybody online. We're delighted all of you are here. I have to start by thanking Max and his team for, first of all, providing the space and the food and the wonderful venue in which we can talk about some really important issues, but also to thank Max for being a great partner. You have at your seat a two-page document, Renewing America's Civil Service. This is a joint venture, if you will. Sometimes I call it a partnership, but it's hard to have a partnership with a partnership without getting confusing. So we call it a joint venture in which together our two organizations who care a great deal about the workforce that serves us all every day are trying to do some things to modernize the civil service system, as Max just said. I won't go into great detail about what we're doing. You'll see some of the background of the initiative, including our distinguished advisory panel that is led by Paul Volcker. And I have the great pleasure for the first time in my life of working for somebody taller than I am. And he is tall, let me tell you. So it is great to, and he would be here today, I'm confident, but for the fact that he is at the very near end of writing his memoirs. And you think about a man who started his service in the Johnson administration, was head of the Federal Reserve in the Carter and Reagan administrations, served distinguished commissions for the United Nations, and came back into government in his 80s to help with the Economic Recovery Commission to lead that effort. This is a man who's got a lot to say, and there are some interesting stories that will be in that book. So when it comes out, you may find it something worth reading. I want to take just a second and talk a second more about the Alliance. So the Alliance was created in 2013. We're relatively new, so many of you may not know the organization. And we are interested in one thing, making the management of government more effective. That's our mission, to advance the effective management of government. We work at all levels of government, not just at the federal government level, but clearly we have great interest in what happens here. Chairman Volcker, as was indicated, started this organization out of his own passion for public service and his own passion for being sure government works. And it is that passion that we try to carry forward in our efforts to work with government, whoever's in charge, whoever. You can believe in big government, you can believe in small government, but if you're going to have a government, it needs to work well. It needs to be effective, and that's what we are trying to advance. And we do that by working with partners, with universities, with people in government, with groups like the Partnership for Public Service. And one of the critical components, we believe, of an effective government is the people. It is, after all, the people that make government work. We talk a lot about the need for better data systems and up-to-date data systems, but you still have to have the people. So that's something that we have a great concern about. You also would see at your chair, and online, it's online for those of you who are online yourself, a new report issued yesterday called Preparing Tomorrow's Public Servants. Now, Max pointed out that there are 6% of the federal workforce under 30. There are about 25%, slightly less than that, people under 30 in the other sectors, the public sector, the nonprofit sector and the private sector. So somehow there's a disconnect in getting people into government. And that's what today is about. That's what this report's about. And if you take time to look at the report, which, by the way, is based on what we heard from over 1,000 or about 1,000 workers, again, at all levels of government, who are in their mid-career, and what it is they think they need, what they're facing. And it isn't necessarily what we thought it might be. It is the number one issue for them is help in being resilient because of the difficult circumstances they face. So we hope that this will create a good conversation about how we go about preparing people to come into government. It's tied to the very topic that we're here today to talk about, which is how do we make the process work better? How do we make the civil service match the workforce needs of today? So I hope that all of us understand that our primary responsibility as people interested in public service and interested in the federal government is to deliver a government that works to the people of the United States. So today's event, we hope, will get to the very heart of these issues. It's, as we all know, 40 years since the Civil Service Reform Act. There have been a lot of changes since then. We believe that we have assembled a group of speakers and panelists that can offer some insights about how they are thinking about the workforce of the future, what they believe needs to happen with the civil service to make it competitive and agile and independent and ready for the challenges that we will face moving forward. Government will only get more complex. Every day we pick up and read about artificial intelligence and all sorts of new developments in data that are going to change the way government works, just like it's going to change society. And we have to be ready for that. And the only way we will be ready is to be sure that we take care of the people we have in government, be sure they're getting what they need to do the job, and also attract bright new people into government. So we hope today will be exciting and interesting. We urge you to participate and to help us explore all these issues more deeply. We have a fantastic moderator for today's conversation. Libby Casey is an on-air reporter and anchor covering politics and accountability for the Washington Post. She will be introducing our panelists and guiding us through what I'm certain will be an enriching conversation. So, Libby.
Thank you so much for being here. It's really an honor to be here and to be able to talk about public service and how we look towards the future. Thank you to our guests. And I want to let our audience know that's here in person that you can ask questions. That'll be a big part of our discussion today. We'll set up some microphones and you can go to them. We'll also be taking questions online. You can use the hashtag that I have right here, New Civil Service, and we'll be fielding some of those questions as well. So I'm Libby Casey, and I'm pleased to introduce our two first guests. Jeff Pond, Director of the Office of Personnel Management. Welcome. So nice to have you here. Of course, he took the job in March, so coming into that position fairly recently, hitting the ground running. He has 25 years in public and private sectors, including a stint at OPM in the past in the administration of President George W. Bush. So he does have some experience there, in particular in implementing new systems. So we can talk about that a little bit. And we also want to welcome our other guest, Margaret Weichert, Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and and budget. Also has more than 2 decades of career, most recently at Ernst & Young as a principal, an innovator, someone who also is an inventor. So you're bringing that now to the public sector, just took the job at the end of February. So welcome. I want to get this conversation started, Director Pond, by talking about where you go, where you start, because you've set the ambitious goal of, by midterm elections, having a plan, which I'm sure a lot of people in the room know this is part of the goal, have a plan to really reform civil service. Can you give us a preview?
Sure. Thanks, Libby. I wanted to thank the partnership for putting this on in the Volcker Alliance. I know there's a lot of organizations that are trying to get the government to work better. It's high time that we've actually done that. 40 years, maybe even 70 years old, many of our civil service laws, regulations, pay systems. It's important to have a leader to be a catalyst for change, but moreover, it's important to have people around the human resource government community to be the agents of change. We've listened to all of the Chicos, and we've taken a look at what the community problems are, listened to good government groups such as the Partnership and Volcker, and getting ideas from past directors. I just was with Kay James, I was with Don Devine and Beth Colbert. So we're making sure that we're listening to a lot of people without getting too far ahead of ourselves and change. But I will tell you, the things that we are going to be doing is going to be very aggressive. And what I mean by that is we will have a legislative agenda where we hope to partner with our congressional members on some substantial change, some substantial authorities that the OPM director may want to have. For instance, cybersecurity. It's one of the most important topics for the government. DHS is doing a marvelous job with Angie Bailey over there. They have some direct hire authority, and it seems to be working. Why wouldn't I have, as the director of OPM, the power to actually do that for the rest of government? So those are some of the issues. If we're changing many of the things, should we do it piecemeal, agency by agency, or occupation by occupation? I intend to do that because that's with some of the authorities of OPM. But there's also the power of the president, the executive orders that he has, and also agency-wide type of authorities, the NDAA, the DHS, and also VA. They have bills that you can get some change there. We're going to be prosecuting all four. The details on those things will be in and along the lines of much more competitive based. I want to make sure that we have a data lake that has compensation data, not just from the traditional sources like CBO and also Bureau of Labor Statistics. I want to make sure we can scrape from salary.com, Glassdoor, the wiki approach to salaries. And we should all get that data and have that data to compare whether we're over and under our whole total rewards package by occupation, by agency, by region. If we all had that data, we could actually be much more intelligent about how we're deploying our resources and our benefits. Most people are talking about you're taking away this, you're massaging that. You have to look at the totality of the system and say, from here on in, what does the next 40 years look like? We're not taking into account, as Mr. Ross said, certain things that are happening out there. Jobs aren't jobs anymore. They're not individual sports anymore. It's a team sport. There's half of our population is participating in some sort of freelance work. If you take a look at Freelance America, it's a book that was out in 2017. It estimates that the Americans are a third of the people are doing freelance work, and by 2027, it'll be about half.
I have to point out some by choice, some not by choice,
Sure.
because they just cannot make ends meet without that. I do, before we move on, want to ask you about the proposition that the administration has put forward to freeze federal pay next year. And of course, we saw that during the Obama administration as well. What sort of a signal does that send as you talk about evaluating salaries?
Yeah,
and yet we hear from the administration a message of...
We have different organizations looking at salary. So there's the Federal Salary Council. There's different organizations that actually look at that. When people say freeze, it means freeze across the government. I'm not one for a peanut butter approach. of how to compensate people. I'm looking more towards, hey, are we overpaying and underpaying different types of occupations, and using those funds to actually right adjust some of the underpaid jobs and the overpaid jobs. It'll take care of itself with attrition. And, we need to take a look at the cost structure of the federal government. If we keep on peanut butter approaching our salaries, our benefits, all of our things, you're not going to be competitive as a total package with the private sector and nonprofit organizations. And that's really the war of talent. We have a total force that is not just government, but it's our contractor environment. And we need to take a look at balancing those costs and assets.
Yeah, and I just wanted to piggyback. One of the reasons we asked Congress for $1 billion workforce fund was actually to look at this market for talent, the real competitive market for talent, and apply much more market-driven competitive realities, and also a total compensation perspective. And so there's a lot of data that from different sources that has a different perspective, but much of the data is just looking at pay. And in the marketplace, people look at total compensation, and they look at all of the things that a job package has to offer, including retirement benefits, job security, and other elements, including making a difference. So when you look at sort of market factors, you don't get paid as much to work in public relations or in a nonprofit, in part because there's great demand for doing those jobs because people enjoy doing those jobs. And so we need to bring much more market discipline. But I think the $1 billion workforce fund gets to the notion that we're not talking about freezing pay. We're talking about aligning to market incentives.
We did just see, and this was reported in the Washington Post, that you sent a letter to the speaker that's raised a lot of concerns among union groups and among other stakeholders, calling for $143.5 billion in cuts to compensation. Why move forward with that right now when you're...
Annuity. Yeah, it's not compensation, salaries.
But important components of what makes it desirable to work for the federal government.
Sure.
Why move forward with that proposal now when you're looking at this holistic and thinking about this more big picture?
These are actually modest proposals. If you take a look at the ratio of, we spend about $8.1 billion in retirement every month, not a year. Every month. The total budget for salaries and expenses in the federal government is about $200 billion, on up a little bit more. So if you think about $81 billion versus the $200 million, you can make an argument by saying the cost model for supporting ongoing defined benefits programs has to be looked at. We'd like to have defined contribution programs. Don't get me wrong. I want to make sure that the federal employee can actually own their investment and can take it with them, can come in, come out, and that's a key component for updating the workforce. I don't believe that we should look at a federal job for 30 years and then retire and then have lifetime retirement anymore. I really want them to start investing on TSP more and making sure that the government can be a little bit more generous on the TSP and go up to the $18,500 and use that as a very good vehicle for them to take with them if they go outside the federal government and take that back. I also want people to get rehired in the federal government non-competitively after they've had a rotation in the private sector, because most people know that the workers that are joining the workforce or are in the workforce in the last 10 or 15 years, they're jumping from job to job, place to place, because jobs are no longer just jobs. They're more projects that are cyclical. The things that we announced in terms of moving from high threes to high fives, those are very, very modest proposals. You should see some other conversations that we will have in the future for restructuring the whole compensation for the federal government. think that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be relieved that we're going to be sunsetting, grandfathering a lot of different types of things. But it's just like CSRS and FERS. We had a cutoff time, and FERS was designed to make enhancements for people to go inside and outside government. That was a long time ago, too. I think it's a high time that we actually did it again.
Let me remind you, you can ask questions. We'll get those microphones ready. Deputy Director Weichert, as you've come in from the private sector, what has most surprised you or interested you in how the public sector is working and the way federal agencies manage their people compared to what you've seen?
I think it's a great question. I expected that there would be great people here, and I've been absolutely proven correct in that assumption. I was surprised by the appetite for change among people who have been here for a long time and people who have come more recently. There's a lot of stereotypes about Washington in particular, I think, about being very invested in the status quo, and that hasn't been what I've found. I think the biggest thing that was a lesson learned for me, which shouldn't have been a surprise, which is, the foundations of our government were made by lawyers, not business people. And so the disciplines that are rewarded and kind of super deep here in DC are around public policy and law and making change happen by pushing documents around. So the law is passed, therefore change will happen. That isn't actually how things work in the private sector. Somebody sends a memo and then the work starts. And so maybe the biggest change is how hungry I've found people in Washington for some of the basic management disciplines, things like change management, things like rewards and recognition. The people here, the FEV survey, the employee survey, highlights the fact that one of our highest scores as a place to work is around meaningful work. But one of the things that turns our people off the most is when they feel like they can't make change happen. So that was really the most edifying and in some ways surprising learning, that there is a rich vein and desire for change that is untapped in part because people feel like they're handcuffed by policy and regulation and frankly lack of management and leadership.
Would you like to weigh in on that?
I couldn't agree more. Part of the change agenda that we have in OPM and the civil service with the PMA was demanded by the career civil service HR community. They've told us a lot of things that are not working because of the laws, regulations that we haven't changed for the last 40 years. So I'm really making sure that we can free up many of the rules, the changes, so that they can actually hire the right people. We're going to be making a big push. We're making an announcement about agencies that have STEM, defense and intelligence organizations having a lot more higher authority. And that we're not giving up merit systems principles. We're going to enhance veterans' practices of hiring, but we need to make sure that we have these agencies lead with the new skills that we need in the federal government. Margaret and I have been talking about the PMA for a little while, for the last couple of months, but a very important component of that is reskilling our workforce. It's making sure that we can hire the right people, but also have the people that are existing go to different types of occupations and skills. And that's really what the Workforce Fund is about. It's making sure we can identify the moves and shifts to skills that we'll need for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. This is not a partisan thing. This is actually a down payment on where we need to go. When you think about what our equivalents are doing in the private sector, they're talking about bots and Internet of Things, the personalization, segmentation, standardization, those things, digitization, those things are slow in the government. But we need to get people that actually, what I call, do it for the living, and we're lucky to have. We have small pockets of people coming, and I know, the statistic about, only 6% are below the age of 30. We need to do what other generations have done. We need to make sure we have like a GI Bill for certain critical occupations and start getting partnerships with our colleges, universities, and two-year vocational schools and start having them come on board non-competitively. Those are some of the things that we're going to be considering with different agencies and across government. We need to reinvigorate the skills and talent that we have for the next 40 years and preserve the quality of workers that we have currently in our workforce because they're direly needed. This whole talk about downsizing and right-sizing didn't come from our offices. We're talking about making sure that the government works much more efficiently and effectively and upskilling the workers.
Can you give us your pitch for someone who's young, who's finishing either a trade school or is coming out of a graduate program? Why would they want to work in government? I mean, what's the pitch, especially at a time when we're hearing a message of drain the swamp and sort of, the rhetoric of that federal workers are somehow part of the problem of a productive government?
So I love this, and I've actually been giving this pitch. I've been going to Silicon Valley. I've been talking to young people. We've got a group called the U.S. Digital Service that, frankly, we make that pitch to and have been very successful in bringing folks to government with different skills. But the base of the pitch is when you go out and look in the private sector, all of these private sector companies are trying to tell you about purpose and mission. And they're having to really work very hard. They're talking about what happens after hours. If you go and work for a bank or you work for a tech company, purpose and mission is very often linked to the work you do after hours. Here in government, we have the best purpose and the best mission. We're here serving the American people. We're making people's lives better. We're keeping people safe. We're doing what our founders intended us to do. These are the best jobs, and we're working to make sure that you can make a difference in doing those jobs. So if you want to have meaningful work, if you want what you do for a living to actually matter, that's why I came to government. And I tell my children that this may be the most meaningful work I ever do. And I am honored and privileged to be here. And by the way, your country needs you.
It's a really large message that we're carrying. It's not just about the overall mission, as Margaret has said. It's actually looking at the standard in which we hold the civil service. Think about how we think about military service and how we respect the men and women that serve in the military. I'm not taking anything away from that. My dad's a veteran. My brother's a veteran. My niece is in the first-year academy in the Air Force Academy. So service is not something I take lightly. But the civil service, think about the civil service. And think about the stories we just heard. 27 finalists in the Service to America medals. What we heard was nanotechnology that serves as markers. We talked about battling the Zika virus, disaster preparedness with systems so that when things start happening, we can warn people. Electronic transistors that actually make your iPhones and Androids much more efficient. Those are the things that your civil service federal colleagues are doing. Those stories are great. I would argue that some of those people should be getting the Fermi and Nobel Prizes. And yet, we have a standard that doesn't recognize the federal worker in the same light that we value service in the military. There are people in and around this town on the video right now that have served 20, 30, 40 years in amazing careers, and yet we don't celebrate them. I think that's a travesty, and I think we need to change that culture too. It's not just about pay systems. It's not just about those things. It's really about the foundation of the call to service. What's our moonshot?
How do we do that in an age when we do hear drain the swamp? And people may not realize, everyone in this room does, that federal workers aren't just here in this town. They're all over the country. I used to live in Alaska. Federal workers were a huge part of the workforce there. But we hear criticism, sort of blanket criticism of drain the swamp.
Yeah, so that is actually one of the things I'm taking a storytelling approach to, that it's really important that people recognize that 85% of the federal workforce actually works outside of D.C. We launched the President's Management Agenda from Kansas City for a very purposeful ability to tell that story. And we visited, I think, probably 12 different agencies. We probably met and listened to 500 or 600 federal employees. I want to use marketing, which is a skill set that the private sector uses all the time. And in this realm, I see mostly used in political campaigns. I want to use marketing as part of change management and telling stories about not only what our people are doing, but more importantly, how we're helping Americans, how we're actually doing the mission. And people, it's the thing that people don't realize that they depend on, like electricity. When it's gone, they really start to notice. We need to remind people, I was joking this morning about Pokemon Go. I admit it, I play Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go is a great innovation done by folks in Berkeley, one of my alma maters, that uses data from 3 government data sources. It uses GPS data, a U.S. government innovation. It uses NOAA weather data, and it uses monuments data. So it's that kind of story where we get out of D.C. And part of my goal within the administration is to tell this story inside the administration, to remind people of the work we're doing to support the American people who were represented and represented in every district in America.
Let's get to the microphones. If you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us who you're with or why you're here, and then throw the question to the panel, please.
Good morning, Director and Deputy Director. My name is Joshua May. I am 29 years old from the Defense Department, but I started my career at 16. My mother started her career at 18, and that's because the federal government intentionally went into her high school and recruited for the summer, and I think we need to get back to that. I say that because if it wasn't for me writing a letter to the Secretary of the Navy at 16, I probably wouldn't be standing in front of you. And I feel as if we wait until community college and undergrad and grad school when we teach civics in high school. And so I think it's at that 16 year, 17 where we need to get them, because I think it's easier to get an 18-year-old a TSSCI when they have nothing than when they're 22 and 23.
What do you put on your SF-86 when you're 18?
Well, but I was in that shoot.
Yes.
But I enjoyed it because I knew I wanted to raise my right hand and defend the Constitution.
Absolutely.
And so I think for me, just like at 17, if I want to be a Marine, with parental consent, I think we need to go back to that same model, because you do have civil servants, even at 16, who say, I want to try something different than everybody else during the summer.
I think I applaud you for your service and your career commitment and making sure we have that statement be public. We need to have more feeder systems into our federal government civil service. When I was at the U.S. Department of Energy, we helped sponsor a program called the Hispanic Youth Symposium. Many people know it because it's actually grown to many different cities. It actually has people go into different types of schools, sometimes in the poorest areas in the nation, and we make sure that people take their SAT and apply to college. And we partnered with the Hispanic College Fund to get different types of scholarships. And our DOE complex, which included government and contractors, employed many of the people from that program. And we had this program called the Future Leaders Program. It was a 2-year program kind of modeled after the PMF, but it was more agency specific. And to this day, I can actually see the leaders. It tickles me when I see the leaders from those programs that we started 10, 12 years ago, actually becoming the 14s, 15s, and SES, and even Chico. I won't name that agency, but they know who they are, and I'm actually visiting with them later on this afternoon. Those are the meaningful feeder programs that we need, and it's a private-public partnership. The Volcker Alliance has one of the, on their board, they have Lester Lyles. If you don't know Lester Lyles, Admiral Lester Lyles, he was the person in charge of the Air Force's Space Defense Initiative, Star Wars. When you have an African-American general going to a school and saying, I was you, and you need to be with us, it changes the trajectory of a person's career. That's the type of inspiration we need in our programs versus send your resume to USA Jobs and maybe get a reply by email. We need to change the tenor of our recruitment. I'm relying on each and every one of the federal managers to be the best recruiters. It's not just the HR departments that need to recruit. It's every single person talking about why I believe my service is important to this country and why I believe that you should join us.
Let's go to our next question.
I'm Joe Davidson with the Washington Post. I have a question about the pay freeze for both directors. Director Pond, given your desire to have comprehensive civil service reform, which would include compensation, which of course includes retirement, and you also talked about the need to gather the data on pay issues, why propose the compensation cuts, the retirement cuts now, as you did in your letter, before a comprehensive civil service reform package? And you previously said you didn't want to nibble around the edges, so why not do it all at the same time?
Yeah, so when I do things just from a management standpoint, I'm really a classic HR person. You know, when you ask somebody in HR, when is it a good time to do something? What is the general response from an HR person? You all know the HR people now, right? Because there might not be a tomorrow, and the liability and the risk of actually doing something may pass you by. So most HR people that I know of in the federal government, thumbs up, we need to make sure that we can keep on doing things. Sometimes it makes sense to make it as a package, but I need to make sure that we keep on having progress every single day, because there is a window of opportunity for us to change the civil service and make sure that we accomplish the things in the PMA, but they're down payments for the long term and the future, so that we can start changing things incrementally and holistically. Those are some of the proposals that we'll be coming out with, and there'll be many of them. As I said, there's those 4 things that we're going to be having a hardcore press on, and you'll see more to come. And we're bringing people along with us that want to share in this journey. I have dialogue with unions. We may not agree with some of the things that I'm proposing and the president's proposing, but at least we have that dialogue. At least we know where we each are, and we're trying to make sure that we're doing it in collaboration, so when we do have a new system that we're proposing, we're not surprising each other on the ideas. I'd like to make sure that we have a collaborative approach to change versus policy you must do. In this town, when you do the policy you must do and you don't listen to the community that actually has to enact these things and work with these tools, they're more and more difficult to do if you have that type of approach.
And Director Weicker, Mick Mulvaney has said that in proposing the pay freeze, he said it would be for everyone, even everyone in the federal workforce, even as he acknowledged those at the higher end of the workforce are probably underpaid. So why have a pay freeze that would punish those who are already underpaid compared to those in the private sector? At the same time, if you exempted them, the pay freeze would fall on those who could least afford it. And what is the rationale for a pay freeze during a period of a growing economy, and when, as has been acknowledged today, the government has trouble attracting younger workers?
So again, as I shared earlier, the perspective is looking at total compensation and looking at what is aligned with the market of today. The places we have the biggest difficulty in attracting talent are with millennials and with a much more mobile, agile, resilient workforce that isn't looking to come to a job that's narrowly defined and work there for 30 years. They're looking to gain experiences. And in the areas where we believe there is the biggest gap in terms of pay, things like cyber, data science, it's a fierce war for talent. And elements of mobility, agility, and purpose are frankly our biggest drivers. Again, I shared the experience we have with the U.S. Digital Service. These are folks from Silicon Valley with deeply competitive skills. We're actually taking pay cuts in order to work on the mission of government and leave after a couple of years. So they're term employees. So coming back to your broader question, the issue of the pay freeze was to get the data to more narrowly look at total compensation. The one thing we know for sure is to attract the talent, particularly the younger talent, retirement as a piece of that broader puzzle needs to be more flexible. It needs to be much more aligned to the way the younger people are being compensated with portable retirement programs. And that is one area where we also know we have a huge expense. And so threading all of those together, the goal is not to punish. The goal is obviously not to be out of alignment with the market. It's critical that we asked for the $1 billion workforce fund in order to do incentives for recruiting and retaining the highest and best talent. But as we move to a system that really rewards performance and is more targeted to the jobs we need for the 21st century, that was the package that worked together.
Next question.
We have a question from Twitter from Mark Betka, which is, how will you be introducing mobility and flexibility into civil service positions to attract the young talent who do not want to hold the same job in the same bureau or agency for decades?
Yeah, I think mobility is a very key thing, not only on the daily life, but also in your career. We need to make sure that our systems, you can have people go in and go out and have public-private partnerships. We can actually have limited term appointments where people come work for 2 or 3 years, go out and work another 2 or 3 years. You know, some of the things that really make me wake up in the morning and jump out of bed are some of the things that I'm seeing government doing right now. And it's unlike government that I've seen. You know, I don't mean to embarrass Sydney, but she's right over there, Sydney. She actually has, in our sub-basement in OPM, a design lab, human-centered design lab. It looks more like California than the sub-basement of OPM, let me tell you, I've been there. And we have data scientists now. I didn't have data scientists 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. Now we actually have them in our agency, and they're working across agency. Along with GSA and OPM, we're trying to make sure that there are more and more pockets of these different types of collaborations, design centers, figuring out problems across government as opposed to within your own organization. That's what excites me. It's a new way of working together in the federal government. You know, when I go and visit some of my colleagues and friends in California, where I'm from, D-Labs are popping up in every single organization. Yet there's very, very few people that understand the process of a D-Lab and have instructors. We actually teach design down in the sub-basement. We have a professor from RISD that we were lucky to actually recruit. We have some people that don't really look like government, and when I say don't really look like government, I hope government looks more like them in the future than now, right? When I came to government about 15 years ago, I had to buy more ties, and I still have a pretty good supply of ties now at 15 years later. But I'll tell you, in our laboratories, it's a completely different culture, and I hope that culture gets infused into our organization and we can actually unleash innovation and change. You know, certain things, technology that's out there, we can leapfrog a lot of things with cloud, with Internet of Things, with blockchain technology. Those are some of the things that I think we need to start experimenting and playing with. You're hearing it from a HR guy that we need to make sure that we leverage technology and data with our workforce that's consistently evolving and changing. If we start doing those things and supporting the president's management agenda, which specifically addresses those three areas, you're going to actually see exciting new government.
I hate to cut you off, but we're tight on time. This gentleman has been so patient. Can we just get one more question in here for the panelists?
Thank you. Anand Desai with the IRS. I also spend a few hours a week as a steward with our employee union, NTEU. Want to thank you and our Treasury leaders for a comprehensive support staff training curriculum. So that's great. That's a big part of improving our workforce practically and cost effectively. I have a question about what can federal agencies do to promote the dialogues and fresh ideas from employees to innovate and align the agency's resources with their mission, that kind of thing, break down silos, avoid the promotions based on, kind of not bothering the other parts of the agency too much. What can we do to promote this dialogue, especially?
Yeah, I'm just going to cut you off just because we're tight on time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic story and a fantastic question. I said story because I'm obsessed with stories. I think storytelling is part of how we break down silos. And I was telling people earlier, I discovered iMovie. It's really easy to make a movie, and so now everything's an iMovie for me. But I'm actually inviting my own employees to tell me their Fed stories. So we're going to call it #MyFedStory. And I want people to send me rough videos talking about what they do and how their mission is helping people. I want to hear about problems. And I think the more we use technology as personal tools to help talk about what we do, it may be complicated. So having to think about, the Instagram version or the Twitter version is actually pretty helpful to boil down what we do so that my mother could understand it, because my mother doesn't understand a lot, but she can understand when I talk about what I'm doing to help farmers or why I came to Washington. When she first heard me say I was coming, she was like, I don't know about that. But when she heard me talk about the missions that people have and how technology is getting in the way, or how, financial systems are getting in the way, it actually engaged her. So I would encourage you to tell your stories, use technology, get your teams to tell their stories.
Do you see a more formal path that people could do that? Are you talking about implementing systems?
Yeah. So I don't want to I don't want to make news, but there will be more to come. I'm like looking at someone who's giving me like an eye. There are more things, so again, I'm a marketer, so there'll be more things where we're looking to use the platforms and the tools that we already have to help tell these stories. Rewards and recognition, we've talked a lot about pay, but I have a book that I've given everyone, 1,001 ways to reward employees, and only one of them is pay. Telling stories, like elevating people's work, helping recognize people's work, that's really, really important. So there will be more to come.
Okay, stay tuned. Well, thank you so much, Director Weichert and Director Pond. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. We'll bring up our next panel.
Thank you so much.
Quick shout out to the FLRA people in California that are on a delay. They're going to actually view this in about 3 hours.
Great. And we can bring up our next panel now. Thank you so much for your patience. Great, fantastic.
I'll come over here.
Have a seat. I don't bite, I promise.
No, I know. How you doing?
Bye. So nice to see you. Thanks so much. Do you guys want some water? We can just
Thank you very much.
For our next panel, I'd like to introduce Major General Charles Bolden, former administrator of NASA. Of course, he has a long and storied career as well in the Marine Corps. Thank you so much for being here with us. We've also got Adam Schuldge, who's Division Chief, Urban Transit Programs at the Federal Transit Administration, Department of Transportation. Thank you, Adam, for being here. He is a previous Sammy winner. He squeaked in as a 35-year-old winning that. I'm gonna reveal your age later, because part of the reason why we want to hear from you is because you represent the young federal workforce. He also spent time in the private sector as well. Russ Dio, former Undersecretary for Management, Department of Homeland Security. He served in that position from 2015 to January 2017. And in that number 2 position, of course, huge budget at that agency, so much personnel, huge portion of government sector at work there. Also spent a lot of time in the private sector, retiring from Johnson & Johnson back in 2012. So we welcome you, and we're here to get a sense from you of public service and how it can improve and reform. So, General Bolden, let's start with you. NASA is a storied place of dreams. I mean, my 2-year-old already wants to be a spacewalker, an astronaut. I don't even know how she knows that, but she wants that. And yet at the same time, when we see the curbing of programs and the shuttering of storied programs, how do you recruit talent and show them that an organization like NASA is going somewhere and is a place that's growing?
Well, when people talk about the shuttering of storied programs, they're in this generation, they're probably talking about shuttle. I'm a shuttle guy, and shuttle its time had come and gone, and it was time to move into something that the current generation can relate to, which is commercial space. And it's the opportunity for someone to, like your daughter, to go to space without having to become a NASA astronaut, which is like harder than becoming an NFL football player sometimes, you might think. So when we made the transition during the Obama administration, one of the things we did was we went to the workforce and we said, this is the way we think the agency can be in the future. But here are some things we have to do if we're going to get there. We can no longer fly shuttle and transition to the new program. We can no longer stay in low Earth orbit and get humans to Mars. And we made the workforce a part of those visions and goals. And as the first panel talked about, you ask them all the time, but more importantly, you don't just ask them, you listen to them and you engage them and you give them an opportunity to see that their suggestions are in fact being heard and acted upon, not just heard. It's one thing I talk about diversity and inclusion. Diversity is really important, but diversity doesn't work if you don't have inclusion. If you don't listen to people and then act upon what they say, then you may as well not have the diversity programs that you have.
In the Partnership for Public Service's annual Best Places to Work rankings, NASA's been ranked number 1 among large agencies for the past 6 years. Yeah. What do you attribute that to?
People. It's people. And let me just, quick question. How many folk in here are not civil servants? Okay, so, but for those who are civil servants, message to you, you are not the problem. Okay, Max will tell you, I had a big engagement with Congressman Mark Meadows, who was undertaking a project several years ago about trying to transform the civil service workforce. And he came over and talked to Max, and he wanted to get an idea of some of the really bad places in government that he could go talk to people and, figure out how to change things. Max said, time out. How about trying to go to some of the places that are good places in government, get a feel for what it should be like, and then go from there. Then you can go to the other place. So NASA is the best place to work in the federal government. It remains so because it has the best people, I think, in the federal government. Not to say that anybody in the IRS or anywhere else is not as good. You're good. You're just not as good.
Okay, you're laying down a challenge for anybody who wants to
It's like the Marine Corps and the other services. There's the Marine Corps, and then there are the other services.
I know enough to not take on this fight. Yeah. Adam, let me turn to you. So you're under 40, and I am revealing your age because you made an active decision to go into civil service. Tell us a little bit about your decisions and why you chose to redirect your career path to work for the government.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm really honored to be here. DOT is actually the 4th best place to work, and we're celebrating it this week with a major celebration in our atrium with our secretary. So, the connection to mission is actually very, very important everywhere. And while we don't fly space shuttles, we will soon have driverless cars, and that's pretty cool too. So I started my career out of college with a job in the financial industry. I found it intriguing and interesting and difficult, and all the things that I was looking for in a career. But what it didn't provide was the public purpose, and that was something that I've strongly been drawn to have as a part of my career. So after just about 5 years doing that, it was 2008. For those who remember what was going on in banking in 2008. I actually proactively left banking in 2008 across the street from Lehman Brothers about 6 months before everything went down. I was in the middle of a graduate degree program for urban planning. So I left that job, studied urban planning, and immediately got myself an internship at the Transportation Planning Organization for New York City. Spent a year there, then a year at the New York City Department of City Planning. When a friend reminded me, hey, didn't you send me a link about something called the Presidential Management Fellows Program once? I heard on a newsletter that the deadline was coming up. So I owe him a lot. But that's how I got into the federal government. And basically from day one, I told everybody I was working with that, I won a lottery ticket. It's an honor and privilege to be working in public service, especially for the federal government. And the opportunities that we have to be leaders in our professions and careers in the federal government is really like nothing else.
Russ Dio, you came to civil service from a long career in the successful private sector. What drew you in, and what stood out to you as you made that transition?
So Adam and I have this in common. It's probably the only thing we have in common is absolute feel for the mission and how important it is, and how critical that purpose is, and how it makes your life meaningful. So yes, I had retired from Johnson & Johnson. I got a call out of the blue from Secretary Johnson, and offering me the job as Undersecretary of Management, obviously going through a complicated process. And I immediately thought about two things. First was 9/11. When I was working at Johnson & Johnson, and the only buildings you could see in New York City from our headquarters in New Brunswick, New Jersey, were the Twin Towers, and we watched them smoke and collapse. I lost 3 friends in my small town, acquaintances, but I consider them friends. And I thought about how critical that purpose and mission is. And then I thought about Jay Johnson, Secretary Johnson, a leader I could trust. Fact-based decision maker, backs up his people, high integrity. Those are the two things that convinced me to come after an appropriate evaluation to make sure that I thought I could bring value. And Department of Homeland Security has the lowest morale of all the federal agencies. I still say it's the best place to work. Very dedicated people, committed to the mission. The morale is going up over the last few years. But it's some of the reasons that the first panel talked about. It's people are dedicated to the mission. What are we doing to help them succeed? And what are we doing to do positive change that people understand to make us even better at it?
It's also the most improved large agency.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
We just heard the
Good
most improved large agency.
It's actually one of the things I'm most proud of. After several years of decline, my last year, it went up a statistically significant amount with a good plan in place to continue that. Thank you.
And what was important was to celebrate that. And I had the privilege of being with Jay Johnson when we publicly talked about what an incredible accomplishment that was. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are as long as you're moving up. And that's the important part. And the workforce wants to do that.
Exactly right.
As you heard Director Weichert and Director Pond lay out their goals, we got a sense of what their top concerns are, and we'll learn more in the coming months about their plan of attack. But as you got a sense of what they're weighing and thinking about, what recommendations would you throw into the mix? What would you like to see be thrown into this conversation as we think about the civil service workforce of the next 40 years? Mr. Dio?
Sure, I'll go first. For me, it starts with the archaic hiring process, the classification system, definition of jobs that no longer apply to the needs today and how people work. It's project after project. It's the old classification system and the old process simply doesn't work. It needs to be simplified. It needs to be accelerated, and we need to give the hiring managers more flexibility. They need feedback from interviews, from references, as well as the narrow things that people look at now. I'm hoping that Congress can be interested in this. This is not a political issue whatsoever. This is a modernization issue. Hopefully it's something people can get behind. So for me, that's what it's all about. The second piece is once people come in, how to retain them, the flexible benefits, et cetera. But I think leadership has a critical role there, the kind of role I had and others have to make sure that people are listened to, the right culture is created. But from a civil service perspective, for me, it's all about the hiring process, simplifying that, accelerating it, not stuck in the old classifications, but modernized.
Mr. Zilga?
I really appreciated the positive tone and the appreciation expressed by both Jeff and Margaret. But in particular, I liked Margaret's idea for storytelling. Recognition is very important to me and to all of my employees, my small team. We get recognition on a daily basis. We get it from our supervisors, our executive team. We get it from the secretary. We get it from the people that we work with out in the field. We're talking on the phone on a regular basis with state and local government officials who are looking to implement projects, improve their communities, and the recognition and appreciation we get from them really sustains us. But at the same time, and I'll say, we even get recognition from individual, congressional staffers and members of Congress who know about the work that we're doing in their districts. But the national tone does not really support the good work that we know is happening and that the people we're working with are expressing to us. So the storytelling will go a long way to, I think, raise the public consciousness of the work that everyone's doing in the federal government.
Well, I would add investment in the recruiting side of the business. I'm in the private sector now, and even in the private sector where people have intern programs or co-op programs. We just had a board meeting yesterday, and the question I asked was, we had a significant decrease in the number of interns over the last 6 years, and I asked the question, why is that? And it was because they found that, while they were bringing in lots of kids, they weren't really encouraged because they knew their chances of getting a job were not very good, and there was no satisfaction while they were an intern. So they looked at what they thought they could fill and brought interns in to kind of, it's still competitive, but to give them an opportunity to appreciate the company, to see what it's like. We need to do the same thing on the federal government level. We used to bring interns in a lot. I know we talked about feeder systems. Feeder systems don't work when you have a hiring freeze. And that's just brutal, blunt truth. You can figure out all kinds of ways to make it look good, but if there's a feeder system and people know that they've got to wait years until somebody leaves the workforce before we can bring them in. So we've got to figure out a better way to do whatever it is we're trying to do without freezing hiring, because that doesn't enable an organization to refresh itself.
Be thinking of your questions, because we'll have those microphones out in a moment, and we want to hear from you and get a sense of what questions you have for our panel. Money talks. I mean, the recognition you're speaking about is so essential, and it's something we can talk about. But knowing that you are building equity, providing for a future family, or providing for a family you already have, there's really nothing that can quite compare to that if you're making the tough decision about private sector or a public sector work. How do you get over that hump? And should there be more conversations about making sure that the pay scale is adequate and reflecting the marketplace? And we did hear from the directors earlier about the evaluation system and looking, frankly, at some of the high skill jobs that take, graduate degrees or a lot of tech experience. The compensation just isn't there. Now, it may never get there, and it sounds like from the director's perspective as well, like stepping into the civil service sector, you recognize that you may never make as much as you might if you stayed in banking. But how do we get it up or have that conversation so that people feel like they are being adequately compensated?
I'm happy to go. I want to be honest. The federal government is never going to pay the way that the private sector does. That's why it's the federal government. It works that way. There's, if you're talking about a spaceship, there's a different way that the private sector does a spaceship for the mission, and that's why we can get them for cheaper. They're still as good, but that's the private sector. They have the flexibility, the mobility, the whatever else you want. I think when people don't come into the federal sector because they're looking for pay. I don't think any of us sitting up here came for the pay. We knew that was something that you were going to sacrifice, but you needed other kinds of things. You talked about them. What are other ways to reward people?
Yeah. I completely agree. We should do everything we can to make sure our pay is as competitive as possible. I agree that it's about total compensation. It's not just salary, flexible retirement benefits so people can take them with them. All of that we should be talking about it and addressing. And when you're talking to people you're working with, let's be honest about it. This is what it is. But what we have going for us, as the CEO of Google has said, we have the mission and purpose they can't offer. And to have an opportunity for doing meaningful work with people you like and make fair compensation, that's a gift that most people working in the private sector don't have. It's a meaningful life doing meaningful work. And if you're in a culture where you feel supported, rewarded, not just financially, but otherwise, listened to make improvements to make it happen, that's fantastic. And you can compete anywhere with that. DHS has no shortage of applicants. The problem is finding the right ones and then creating the culture where we live up to their expectations.
Like everyone said, money isn't the reason people join the federal government, the sense of mission and purposes, but at the same time, we volunteer in a different part of our lives. We're here to make a living. We have families, we have responsibilities, and money is important. And the current process, there's the federal pay scale, and there's grades, and there's steps. And grades are largely determined based on scope of responsibilities. But for someone whose responsibilities are deep rather than broad, they may find that they're at a 12 or 13 or 14 level, and that is where they're going to stay. But they may be doing exceptional work. And as a manager, I've heard things like, if there's anything you could do about pay, I've been here a while, and I'm doing an excellent job year after year implementing major national priorities. And I say, well, luckily there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. I wish there was something. And yes, theoretically, I could push quite a bit of paperwork through and get a quality step increase. And we have done those kinds of things in the past. But the system's not built around flexibility.
And that's a necessary change. That's another change that needs to happen.
One of the things we tried to do in NASA is because we're a federal government organization, historically, when someone comes to a center, we have 9 NASA centers around the country. They're born there and they die there, and that's not good. It's not good for their own refreshment. It's not good for their families. And so we try to encourage employees to look at ways that they could go to another center for a period of time, not be penalized because they're moving from one center to another. And they may go from human spaceflight to science. But we've got to give them the necessary training to make that lateral move and then not penalize them once they go. It's like leaving government, going to the private sector and coming back. We make it really hard for somebody to move from where they are, to go out and just to get refreshed and recognize the fact that where they were was really a good place. And that happens sometimes. But we've got to figure out a way to bring more flexibility inside the workforce without penalizing people because they decide they want to move.
And I realized there were 2 other significant benefits that I forgot to mention. One is that the federal government, believe it or not, is a fairly progressive employer. We have fairly open policies around telework and a reasonable work-life balance. So, I have an employee who's a single mother. I have 2, soon to be 3 kids, preschool age and below. It's meaningful that I'm able to be there and chipping in the household. And that is a very valuable part of my career, or my overall compensation package, you could say. And second is the ability to build your career around new opportunities and rotate to do different things. Part of a leadership program recently had me spend 5 months working at OMB in one of the resource management offices, and the perspective that gave me on my own work back at my agency was immensely valuable, but it was also rewarding in a sort of motivational way to know that my office cares enough about me to move me around and gain that perspective and experience.
Great. Let's go to the questions from the audience.
Always spot on, beyond. Awesome.
Do you mind introducing yourself and letting us know?
Hi, I'm Mimi, and just a few things. We have a CIO dashboard that OMB pulls in from a lot of the agencies. It's a really great resource tool. But regrettably, some of that information is not communicated down throughout the organization. We have top down and bottom up, but sometimes it's not hitting all levels. So I love that idea of the storyboard. If we pop up some of those and then people say, oh gosh, I really hit the mark here for that strategic plan goal, it increases the morale throughout the government agencies, and they see that they're making contributions, and that's reflective within their performance appraisal. The other thing I want to touch upon is it's not all about pay, which is great because, hey, I took that oath and I am so happy to be a civil servant. And beyond that civil service, you can also do the paid training. There are other ways to recognize and reward. There are awesome classes that we've got throughout the federal government that we need to really, as managers, help our staff and look across the board. Somebody might have enterprise architecture, somebody might have cybersecurity, somebody might have really great programmatic management experience. We need to use those skill sets across the board. So thank you all very much for being here today, and thank you for making the system better.
Thank you.
Any reflections about those comments?
I agree with all of them. I would point out the responsibility of leadership about the communication. And leadership needs to be measured not only by the outcomes, but how it's done, the how, as well as the what. And I love the idea of the stories. DHS has a 1-minute video, 3-minute video about a day in the life of DHS. Have you seen it? I mean, it just reinforces how critical the work is and how important it is to be a part of that. If that was played at a high school with someone like you demonstrating how meaningful it is, you would attract a lot of people to come and be part of it. But the internal communications is critical, and we just need to get better at it. And one last comment is, it almost sounds like platitudes we're talking about. We really have to do it. And I think the chance to experiment, and you're clearly, Director, encouraging and embracing, let people try new things. They may not work, but let's work on this. If something works, the word spreads fast, not only within that agency, but other agencies. Please don't be afraid by the myths about what you can or can't do. A lot of it's myths. Some of it's real, some of it's not. Go after it. Set an example about how you're communicating and getting your colleagues involved, that you have a strategic plan that's bought into by everyone, all the way down. People understand it and are actually focused on those issues that matter, not just the day-to-day. You can really make a difference by setting those examples, knowing you'll be supported by your leadership, and having the courage. Some things won't work, so be it. We're out there trying, we're showing the change. The people you work with will be so impressed.
Can I add one thing that kind of goes back to what you just talked about? It's we all operate inside a box. And one of the favorite cliches that I hate is we've got to think outside the box. We've got to think inside the box, and we've got to think to the corners. I'm a pilot, not anymore, but when I was flying, the best pilot was the one who learned how to find out what was in that corner of the box where nobody else was going to go, because they knew if you spilled outside the box in an airplane, you're probably dead. But that's a big box. In NASA, what we tried to do was tell people, unless somebody tells you it cannot be done, do it. The way that the agency operated, I mean, I've been gone for almost a year and a half, but the way they operated was continue to run until apprehended. You know OMB has heard this probably from Robert Lightfoot, who just retired, was the acting administrator. And Robert said at one point he got worried because he thought nobody was going to stop him. And it's because we knew what our mission was. We knew what we had in place, and we knew that everything we were doing was going to take years. So keep doing it. I talked with some young ladies who were over in the White House and in the president's initiative on White House program for women and girls. And they were really depressed because they said, what's going to happen? I said, did anybody tell you to stop? Keep going. Until somebody tells you to stop, keep going. Think into every corner of the box you can until somebody says you can't do that. Don't ask them.
I'd like to give one example, too, because it's storytelling, right? And you were talking about Angie Bailey, who came over to be Chico at DHS when I was there, and it was one of the best things that happened. DHS has a huge need for cybersecurity experts. It's the agency with its own complicated materials and files and systems, but also supports other federal agencies as well as the private sector. I won't call it a crisis, but it was serious that we had a huge gap. Angie Bailey and Luke McCormick, our head CIO, planned a hiring fair in D.C. at a hotel where all DHS, the major components, were all there. So you went into this ballroom and you were just impressed with the purpose of the agency. There's the Secret Service limo that protects the president. There is FEMA demonstrating how they're dealing with hurricanes. There is, you get it, all of them there, all at once, connected. We had hiring managers there. We were ready to start the security clearance process. 14,000 applicants, over 800 people showed up. That day, several tentative offers were made that very day. Tentative, not approved, but underscoring it, and eventually over 300 people were hired in a short period of time. I can't tell you how many people told me, you can't do that. Here's all the things you have to do. No problem. And that group they had the backing of the secretary and myself and set a great example. And as you pointed out, Director, they now have hiring authority from Congress to go to the next level. Please take intelligent risk to break through this system. And hopefully we'll get legislative reform, but in the meantime, keep going forward. It's too important not to.
Next question.
Okay, hi, this is Haria Billy. I work with DHS CFO. I think I know you. I remember when you were heading in management, so appreciate your service. I guess it's a common and in general question is that I don't see a couple of things. I don't see a lot of investment in training. We have contract support. I've worked with different agencies before, and it seems like the contract support is much more skilled, and we're utilizing contract support to potentially, the federal employee can do. So it's like we're really paying a lot more for contract support when we can actually redirect that and invest on training to train the people that you already have. So that effort, and then the other part is just as a whole, I work within the CFO DHS, and it's like I think we have 1 or 2% of R&D is invested within the DHS budget. That's kind of sad because that just tells me we're not investing on innovation as the private sector is. I think private sector does a significant amount of investment in R&D because they're looking at 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I don't know. I think this is probably a question for y'all in OMB to try to push more of that focus.
Thank you.
Amen.
Agreed.
Well, the topic of innovation as adjacent to R&D is actually crucial, and I didn't get a chance to mention this earlier, but I tell my employees that innovation is a critical part of their jobs. We can't go to all corners of the box. We manage competitive grant programs, and if we made policy on the fly, we would have a lot of angry states, senators, and so we're careful. We try to not make policy, but our jobs derive their value from proposing policy. If we see something from talking to a state or a city that says, a particular grant program, for example, just yesterday we announced $60 million in investments in passenger ferries. If we see a way that something like that could be more useful for the American public, write it down. Let's make that case. Let's innovate where we can.
Any other comments or reflections about the use of contractors versus people who are employed by the government, who are civil servants, and how to make sure that the civil servants are given adequate training, are given the tools that they need, and are recognized for their work.
One of the complaints I got when I first became the NASA administrator was I came here to be an engineer, and I came here to design things and to make things work, and yet I know I can do it, but we always give it to the contractor. That's a way of life that we need to kind of break from, to the greatest extent possible. There's some things that you just don't have the in-house talent or skill to do. When you talk about cyber, let me tell you, we just don't know it as well as we should. So you go out and you get contractor support to do that. But when you talk about designing a spacecraft or doing something, the kind of things that NASA does, we've got incredible talent in-house. So you have to figure out how do you do the public-private partnership, if you will, and that's where we turn a lot.
I agree. I think it's a balance. The private sector, Johnson & Johnson, other companies are using more and more contractors. They're doing it in roles that they don't see as necessarily critical where innovation matters, and or their consultants coming in helping create that change. So I think this is a trend that's going to continue to happen. What comes down to is the judgment of giving the appropriate training opportunity to critical employees that are the future to make sure they have the chance to develop, rather than contractors that are going to be in and out. But we talked about millennials too. There are increasingly people that are almost like contractors coming in for a couple of years, then going out. We need to find ways of embracing that too and supporting that through public-private partnerships.
Next question.
Anand Desai from the IRS again. Part of our mission and a lot of other federal civilian agencies' mission is frankly being firm but fair with people who are trying to pull one over on the agency and on Congress and the American people. And often they get folks to do that for them who have more experience than us, they have nicer suits, they're more articulate, maybe sometimes they're smarter. So it can be very discouraging when the teams do not come together to effectively see that mission through. So General, I know you come from an organization that has a lot of young people trained to deal with adversity and teamwork and not rely on coddling. So anything we might be able to say learn from the Marines or
okay,
other
thank you
about that?
General?
To be quite honest, I'm not sure I would want you to learn very much from Marines. If you want to learn something from a service, I'd go to DHS and look at the Coast Guard. Yes. I am the Coast Guard's #1 recruiter. I always have been, because the Coast Guard, and I'm going to say why. All services, all military branches train every single day for something they hope they never have to do. That's what we do. The Coast Guard trains every single day because they're going to have to do it that afternoon or tomorrow or whatever it is. And I would say for a young person that really wants to do military service but's not really sure how far they want to go, tell them think about the Coast Guard. I would study the Coast Guard, the way they handle diversity and inclusion, the way they deal with mission and constantly training. Now, it's not perfect, but that's a great example of an organization that I think does it right.
Can we get one last question in here?
Great.
Before we break.
So Charmaine Jones with DHS and U.S. Coast Guard, yay! So I'm actually in the reserves right now, civilian for DHS. So my question is regarding retention. I hear a lot about recruiting, and I think recruiting is great because we do need that, the new savvy millennials into the government. But at the same time, I want to know what efforts are technically being taken for retention purposes, because we have a lot of people who, like, let's talk about recruitment, for example. We have interns who, well, for whatever reason, their internship actually didn't manifest into a job within DHS. And as a matter of fact, I recently had someone who ended up going to Booz Allen because of the hiring process, because it took so long to convert her internship into an actual position. And when they finally converted it, they converted to a 5, even though she had a master's degree. So,
thank you. Thank you. Let's get some response on that. How do you think about retention and making sure that people are able to?
I was going because I'm going to go back to diversity. I'm going to go back to diversity and inclusion again, and because when I think of retention, I don't think of retention when I'm talking about a male. I don't have a problem in retaining males. I've got more males to fill jobs up here than I know what to do with. I don't know how I retain qualified females and minorities beyond a certain level. I can bring them in, I can promote them, I can do everything, and then all of a sudden, either they decide that it's just not worth it, whatever the hassle is, and they migrate to some non-STEM field. And we've got to figure that out, and we've got to undo that. And it's not just the federal government. So here, this is a universal problem, probably in the newsroom. I would imagine, but we've got to figure it out. What is it that allows us to get women to a certain level and then they can't go any farther?
Well, it's nothing new, but providing opportunities for growth within an otherwise conservative environment. I've got young employees who come in with a lot of energy and a lot of motivation, and they really want to do everything all at once. And then we say, well, GAO is here. Can you please maybe just tone it down a notch? But giving those opportunities and managing that balance is the most important thing for us.
To your direct question, and thank you for to me, this is more of a hiring problem than a retention problem. The system should allow a faster transition from internship to a permanent position, and the hiring manager and the management should have more flexibility about what that compensation should be, and that's what we need to change. Then, because this person wanted to stay, so it wasn't a question of demonstrating we want to retain you. It's a question that our systems weren't allowing it to happen. And that's where I think maybe there should have been some myth-busting or rule-breaking, if possible. I mean, there's a strong HR group at DHS, but this is where the change has to happen. It's like when someone leaves to go for a 2-year term in private sector to come back, and they have to come back at the same level they were when they left. It's ridiculous. They come back with new skills, new talents. They don't have to come back as a GS7 when they left as a GS7. That's the stuff we have to change.
Russ Dio, thank you so much. Adam Schildga, and also, of course, General Bolden, thank you so much to all of you for being here. I'm going to hand it. Oh,
thank
sorry.
You.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it back over to Tom Ross with Volcker Alliance.
So join me again in thanking our panelists, and also, please, a warm round of applause for our moderator, Libby Casey. Thank you. Just a couple of quick things. If you didn't get a copy of the new report that was issued, there's some outside. I want to just ask a couple of folks on our team and the partnership team, if they're in here, to raise their hand so you'll know who they are. These are the folks that are working on our efforts around civil service modernization and reform. So Peter Marcy, who's in the back, Maggie Mello, Henry Owens, Troy Cribb. Troy, raise your hand. Christine Simmons. Thank you guys, because they're the ones that are doing all the work, and we're really appreciative of what they do. If you have detailed questions about the report, this is Peter and Maggie's work, so be sure and check with them. Last thing I want to say is that our work is about trying, as I said earlier, to do what we can to make the life of the people that are serving America's citizens every day in government better. Do what we can to make your lives better. Because we know there are challenges, and it may be getting good people in to work with you. It may be providing the development and support and training inside of government for those that are already there. And we want to collaborate with any stakeholder that wants to participate, whether it is agency personnel, policymakers, public employee unions, professional associations, educators, civic groups, anybody who wants to come to the table. We want to sit with them and try to make the system better. And that includes all of you. So we thank you for being here. We thank all of you who participated online. Hope you found this interesting. And go back to your agencies and let's, as was pointed out, keep doing what you can do in the box and maybe occasionally a little bit outside. Thanks so much.